Under the spotlights, surrounded by microphones and applause, a man at the top of the world raises his glass in a silent toast against the sky. In his vision, there is nothing but himself, no higher power, no consequences. If God existed, he says with a smirk, he'd have more important things to worry about than a football game. Laughter echoes, cameras flash, success radiates, but some words reverberate in the void of the universe in ways we do not understand. And sometimes, life exacts its price when we least expect it. The California sun rays reflected off the crystal trophy strategically placed at the center of the shelf. Charles Campbell gazed at his collection of achievements with a satisfied smile. At 28, he was considered one of the best strikers in American football, with a multi-million-dollar contract with the Los Angeles Galaxy and a life most could only dream of. A penthouse in Beverly Hills, sports cars in the garage, and endless parties were just the visible part of an empire built on talent, determination, and, as he liked to say, without the help of any imaginary being. "Charles, you really need to attend the press conference today," said Sarah, his press advisor, interrupting his thoughts. "The sponsors are expecting the official announcement of your contract renewal." Charles rolled his eyes. "They can wait a little longer. It's not like I'm going to lose my contract for being late." Arrogance had become his trademark just as much as the decisive goals he scored. He adjusted the gold watch on his wrist and grabbed the keys to his Lamborghini. As he rode the private elevator down, Charles checked his phone messages, deliberately, ignoring the one from his mother, who, like every Sunday, invited him to church. "When will she understand that I don't believe in that nonsense?" he muttered to himself, deleting the message. The press conference took place in the stadium's luxurious media center, an environment Charles knew as well as the 100 yards of the field. Dozens of reporters fought for space while television cameras broadcasted live across the country. The announcement of his 4-year contract renewal, with a record-breaking deal in league history, was the sports headline of the day. "How does it feel to be the highest-paid player in American football history?" a reporter from ESPN asked. Charles adjusted the microphone with a calculated smile. "I feel like I'm getting exactly what I deserve. My numbers don't lie, and the market only recognizes value when it sees it." The following questions were predictable. Plans for the season, championship expectations, new sponsors. Everything was going as expected until a reporter in the back of the room raised his hand. "Mr. Campbell, many players attribute their success to faith. You've always been vocal about being an atheist. How does that affect your career?" Charles smiled, feeling challenged. This was his cue for the show. "Look, I respect those who need imaginary crutches to get by. But let me be honest. I've never seen God score a goal for me or sign my paychecks. Everything I've achieved has been through my own merit, with hard work and real talent. While some players are on their knees praying before games, I'm on the field practicing my shots. The universe doesn't have plans for anyone. You make your own destiny. And honestly, if God existed, I think he'd have bigger problems to deal with than deciding who wins a football game, don't you?" The room fell momentarily silent, before erupting in nervous laughter and the frantic typing of reporters. Sarah, standing beside the stage, closed her eyes in disapproval. That statement would make headlines, just as he wanted. "But aren't you afraid of some kind of divine retribution for these statements?" the reporter pressed. Charles burst into laughter. "Divine retribution? Please. If God wanted to punish me for not believing in him, I think he would have done before giving me a 9-digit bank account and a mansion in Beverly Hills, don't you think?" Next question. After the press conference, Charles drove to an exclusive nightclub in Hollywood to celebrate with some of his teammates. Between expensive drinks and the company of celebrities, he barely noticed the older man watching him from across the VIP lounge. "You shouldn't provoke what you don't understand," the man said as he finally approached, seizing a moment when Charles was alone at the bar. "Sorry, but do I know you?" Charles replied with disdain. "No, but I know your type. I've seen plenty like you build towers of arrogance, only to watch them crumble. Pride comes before the fall, as the scriptures say. Charles laughed, raising his $200 glass of whiskey in a mocking toast. Well, when my tower collapses, I promise to give you a call for a prayer, okay? Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a party to enjoy. The man simply nodded and walked away, leaving a card on the counter. Charles picked it up instinctively and read, Pastor Thomas Wilson, if you ever need help, don't hesitate. He chuckled and tossed the card into the nearest trash can before returning to his group of friends and ordering another round of champagne. That very night, a photo of Charles toasting with Robert Callahan, a well-known businessman with suspected ties to organized crime, spread rapidly across social media. Just another night of celebrities having fun, or so it seemed. 3 weeks later, as Charles was getting ready for his morning training session, loud pounding on his door startled him. Still groggy and annoyed by the interruption, he went to answer, only to find himself face to face with fully identified FBI agents. Charles Campbell, you are under arrest for money laundering and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. The agent's words felt distant, like a nightmare. He couldn't wake up from. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs, being escorted out of his own apartment as news crews swarmed the lobby, alerted by an anonymous tip. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation. The look of disbelief on his face, his disheveled hair, his training clothes instead of the impeccable suits he usually wore for public appearances. Within hours, the image of Charles Campbell in handcuffs went viral, accompanied by sensational headlines. The fall of an idol, the price of pride, and inevitably, divine retribution. According to the charges, Charles had allowed his name and businesses to be used for laundering money from illegal casinos operated by Robert Callahan's criminal organization. Suspicious transactions, shady investments in offshore companies, and an extensive network of ghost accounts linked to his name made for what seemed like an airtight case. The Department of Justice claimed he had profited millions from the scheme, while evading taxes on those illicit gains. Charles vehemently denied all accusations. "This is ridiculous," he shouted at his lawyer in the interrogation room. "I barely know Callahan. I've met him a few times at events, but I've never had any involvement in his business." But the evidence seemed irrefutable. Emails allegedly sent by Charles discussing alternative investments, documents with his signature on contracts with shell companies, mysterious deposits in overseas accounts. His defense argued that the evidence was fabricated, the signatures forged, the emails hacked, but the court wasn't convinced. After the press conference, Charles drove to an exclusive nightclub in Hollywood to celebrate with some of his teammates. Between expensive drinks and the company of celebrities, he barely noticed the older man watching him from across the VIP lounge. "You shouldn't provoke what you don't understand," the man said as he finally approached, seizing a moment when Charles was alone at the bar. "Sorry, but do I know you?" Charles replied with disdain. "No, but I know your type. I've seen plenty like you build towers of arrogance, only to watch them crumble. Pride comes before the fall, as the scriptures say." Charles laughed, raising his $200 glass of whiskey in a mocking toast. "Well, when my tower collapses, I promise to give you a call for a prayer, okay? Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a party to enjoy." The man simply nodded and walked away, leaving a card on the counter. Charles picked it up instinctively and read, "Pastor Thomas Wilson, if you ever need help, don't hesitate." He chuckled and tossed the card into the nearest trash can before returning to his group of friends and ordering another round of champagne. That very night, a photo of Charles toasting with Robert Callahan, a well-known businessman with suspected ties to organized crime, spread rapidly across social media. Just another night of celebrities having fun, or so it seemed. 3 weeks later, as Charles was getting ready for his morning training session, loud pounding on his door startled him. Still groggy and annoyed by the interruption, he went to answer, only to find himself face to face with fully identified FBI agents. "Charles Campbell, you are under arrest for money laundering and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." The agent's words felt distant, like a nightmare. He couldn't wake up from. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs, being escorted out of his own apartment as news crews swarmed the lobby, alerted by an anonymous tip. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation, the look of disbelief on his face, his disheveled hair, his training clothes instead of the impeccable suits he usually wore for public appearances. Within hours, the image of Charles Campbell in handcuffs went viral, accompanied by sensational headlines: "The Fall of an Idol," "The Price of Pride," and inevitably, "Divine Retribution." According to the charges, Charles had allowed his name and businesses to be used for laundering money from illegal casinos operated by Robert Callahan's criminal organization. Suspicious transactions, shady investments in offshore companies, and an extensive network of ghost accounts linked to his name made for what seemed like an airtight case. The Department of Justice claimed he had profited millions from the scheme, while evading taxes on those illicit gains. Charles vehemently denied all accusations. "This is ridiculous," he shouted at his lawyer in the interrogation room. "I barely know Callahan. I've met him a few times at events, but I've never had any involvement in his business." But the evidence seemed irrefutable. Emails allegedly sent by Charles discussing alternative investments, documents with his signature on contracts with shell companies, mysterious deposits in overseas accounts. His defense argued that the evidence was fabricated, the signatures forged, the emails hacked, but the court wasn't convinced. The trial was a media spectacle. The press unearthed every detail of his life, every excess, every arrogant remark. His controversial statements about religion were played on loop across TV programs, painting him as a man without morals or principles. Sponsors terminated contracts one after another, fearing association with the scandal. The LA Galaxy announced his suspension until the facts were clarified, freezing his multi-million-dollar salary. Friends and colleagues who once fought for his attention now avoided any association with his name. The same celebrities who had toasted with him weeks earlier were now giving interviews, lamenting how they had been deceived by his false persona. Charles Campbell's fall from public grace was as spectacular as his rise had been. Despite the best lawyers money could still buy, public opinion had already condemned him, and the jury followed suit. Charles was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. From the luxury and adoration of fans, he was thrown into the brutal reality of a 6-by-9-foot cell in a medium-security penitentiary. His days, once filled with training on pristine fields, photo shoots, and interviews, were now dictated by the rigid monotony of prison life. Wake-up call at 6 a.m., meals at set times, work in the prison laundry, 1 hour of yard time, lights out at 10 p.m. The first few weeks were the hardest. The shock of his new reality, the constant fear, the humiliation of prison procedures. Charles isolated himself, avoiding contact with other inmates, many of whom recognized him and taunted him for his downfall. "What's up, superstar? Where's your talent now? Can it get you out of here?" They mocked during meals in the crowded cafeteria. "Hey, Campbell, have you prayed today?" Others shouted, reminding him of his arrogant statements about faith. Night, lying on the thin, uncomfortable mattress, staring at the peeling ceiling, Charles replayed every moment that had led him there, every decision, every word he had spoken. The initial anger and indignation gradually gave way to deep confusion. How had his perfect life unraveled so quickly? How had all the evidence lined up against him so perfectly, even though he was innocent? Was it just bad luck, coincidence, or was something else at play? It was during this dark period that Charles received his first visitor, his mother, Ellen. He hesitated to see her, ashamed, but eventually gave in. "I didn't do this, Mom," he said, trying to keep his composure. "I'm being framed. Someone set me up." Ellen held his hands across the table, ignoring the watchful eyes of the guard. "I know, son, and so does God." Charles rolled his eyes, an automatic reflex. "Please, Mom, not now. If your God exists, he has a pretty twisted sense of humor." "Sometimes," she replied calmly, "we have to lose everything to find what truly matters. Maybe this is your trial by fire, Charles. Trial by fire. I'm being punished for something I didn't do." What kind of just God would allow that? Ellen gave him a sad smile. Divine justice works in ways we don't understand. I'm not saying God put you here as punishment. I'm saying that maybe there's a greater purpose, even in the most unfair situations, Charles scoffed. Well, if the grand divine plan was to turn me into a convict, congratulations to him. Mission accomplished. The following week, Charles received another unexpected visitor, Pastor Thomas Wilson, the same man he had dismissed at the nightclub. How did you? Your mother has been attending my church for years, the pastor explained. She asked me to come. Charles almost refused the visit, but something inside him, perhaps the desperation for any human contact that didn't judge him, made him accept. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. You must be satisfied, Charles muttered bitterly. The arrogant atheist finally got what he deserved, huh? That card you gave me that night almost feels prophetic now. Thomas shook his head. I'm not here to judge or to say I told you so. I'm here because everyone deserves a second chance, and because, surprisingly or not, I believe in your innocence. Charles raised an eyebrow, surprised. You're the first person outside my family to say that. Why? You don't even know me. Let's just say I have a good instinct for telling arrogance apart from true wickedness. You may be full of yourself, Charles, but you don't strike me as the kind of man who would get involved with criminals. A second chance? I'm finished. My career, my reputation, everything. And for what? For something I didn't even do. The pastor studied him for a moment. Have you ever considered that maybe this is your chance to discover who you really are? Without all the applause and fame? Sometimes, God puts us in situations where we have no choice but to look inward. Not you too, Charles sighed. If this was God's plan to make me believe, I can tell you it's not working very well. Thomas smiled. Faith rarely comes from comfort, Charles. It tends to grow in the trenches, when we've lost everything we once thought was essential. The pastor's words stayed with Charles long after he left. In the months that followed, against every instinct, Charles began attending the prison's Bible study group. At first, it was just to pass the time and avoid trouble in the yard, but gradually something began to shift. There was a certain peace in those moments of reflection, a clarity he had never experienced amid the chaos of his old life. Charles started to reevaluate his priorities, his values, the person he had become. The biblical stories of perseverance in the face of injustice, Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers, Daniel in the lion's den, Paul and Silas in prison, began to resonate with him in unexpected ways. One particularly difficult afternoon, after being taunted and nearly getting into a fight that could have extended his sentence, Charles found himself alone in the prison chapel, staring at the simple crucifix on the wall. If you're really there, he whispered, feeling both foolish and desperate, I could use some help right now. I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything, hired the best lawyers, but nothing works. If this is a test, I don't know what I'm supposed to be learning, but I'm listening now. His voice broke, and the tears he had been holding back for so long finally spilled over. It was the first time in years, perhaps since childhood, that Charles allowed himself to be vulnerable, to admit he didn't have all the answers, that he couldn't control everything. Meanwhile, in the outside world, a series of seemingly unrelated events began to unfold. An anonymous hacker, known only by the pseudonym Nemesis X, breached the servers of companies linked to Robert Callahan. Over the course of a week, the hacker released internal documents, emails, and financial records suggesting a massive scheme of fraud, bribery, and money laundering. Nowhere in these authentic documents did the name Charles Campbell appear. Even more shocking, among the leaked materials were conversations detailing how to incriminate convenient targets to divert attention from the real operations. Charles was mentioned specifically, with Callahan referring to him as the arrogant player who needs to learn a lesson. The press, which had once fueled his downfall, now began to question the official narrative. Investigative journalists followed the trail of the leaked documents, confirming their authenticity. Pressured by the revelations, the FBI reopened the case. In what the media called an extraordinary turn of events, federal agents arrested Robert Callahan and 6 of his closest associates. During interrogations, one of them confessed to being part of the setup against Charles, detailing how they had forged documents, manipulated bank records, and planted evidence. Campbell was perfect, the informant admitted in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rich, famous, too arrogant to be cautious about who he associated with. No one would question it if he went down, and while everyone watched the big star fall, attention would stay far from our real operations. After 18 months in prison, Charles Campbell was summoned for a special hearing. The judge solemnly announced that all charges against him were being dropped, along with a formal apology from the state for procedural errors and investigative failures that had allowed such injustice. "Mr. Campbell," the judge said, "no compensation can restore the lost time or fully repair the damage done to your reputation. But I hope you find some comfort in knowing that the truth, though delayed, has finally prevailed." Charles walked out of the prison gates to find only 3 people waiting for him: his mother, Pastor Wilson, and Sarah, his former press advisor, who, against all advice, had never stopped believing in his innocence. "How do you feel?" the pastor asked as they walked to the car. Charles took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air of freedom. "Honestly, I don't know. Relieved, obviously, but also different. Like the person who walked through those gates 18 months ago isn't the same one walking out now." "And you're not," Thomas agreed. "Trials change us for better or worse. It depends on what we choose to do with them." "What do you think I should do with mine?" Charles asked, surprising even himself with the sincerity of the question. The pastor smiled. "That's something only you can figure out. But I'd suggest starting by thanking the source of the miracle that set you free." Miracle. It was an anonymous hacker. And who sent the hacker? Coincidence? Luck? Or something more? Charles remained silent, contemplating the question. In the weeks that followed, as he processed his experience, Charles turned down lucrative interviews and book deals about his ordeal. Instead, he started attending Pastor Wilson's small church and volunteering with at-risk youth in a community program, many of them children of inmates he had met behind bars. "Who would have thought you'd have to go to prison to find your purpose, huh?" Sarah joked during one of their weekly lunches, now a tradition that had turned into something more than just friendship. "Life has a strange sense of humor," Charles replied. "Or maybe God does." 6 months after his release, the LA Galaxy offered Charles the chance to return to the team, though with a significantly smaller contract. The decision wasn't easy, but he accepted, not for the money or fame, but for the opportunity to redefine his public image and use his platform for something greater. During his first interview after returning to the field, a reporter inevitably asked about his experience and whether it had changed his views on God. Charles smiled, not the arrogant smirk of the past, but a genuine, calm smile. "You know, I used to think that needing God was a sign of weakness," he replied. "But I've learned that admitting we don't have all the answers, that we don't control everything, that takes more strength than pretending we're invincible." He paused. "I can't explain everything that happened to me. Maybe it was just a coincidence that a hacker decided to expose exactly the documents that proved my innocence. Maybe it's a coincidence that this hacker was never identified, despite all the authorities' efforts. Or maybe there are no coincidences." "So, are you a religious man now?" the reporter pressed. "Let's just say I'm a man who's learned to ask different questions. Before I asked, how can I prove my worth? Now I ask, how can I be valuable to others? It's a subtle shift, but it changes everything. The statement didn't make sensational headlines or go viral on social media. It was too sincere, too simple for the insatiable hunger for scandals. But to those who had known him before, the transformation was undeniable. The following Sunday, after his first game back, where he scored the winning goal to the crowd's delight, Charles sat beside his mother and Sarah in the church pews. When the offering plate was passed around, he discreetly placed an envelope inside, containing the entirety of his first paycheck. "For the community center," he whispered to Pastor Wilson after the service. "To give others a second chance like I had." The pastor nodded, squeezing his shoulder. "You know you don't have to buy God's favor, right?" Charles chuckled softly. "I know that now. But I also know that gratitude without action is just an empty word." As he walked toward the parking lot, Charles paused for a moment, looking up at the California sky, so similar, yet so different from the one he used to see in his old life. Sarah intertwined her fingers with his, a silent gesture of companionship, marking yet another new beginning in his life. "Thank you," he murmured into the air, feeling both foolish and free. There was no audience to impress, no cameras to capture the moment. Just a man acknowledging that his journey, with all its falls and redemptions, might be part of something greater than himself, and for the first time in his life that possibility didn't diminish him. It completed him.